Welcome back, everybody. I'm Matt Williamson, and you are watching Pop Goes the 60s. And today, Glenn Greenberg joins me. And Glenn is a writer, and he wrote a very special piece for Time Magazine. Glenn, welcome. And why don't you tell us what you've been working on?
I worked on a Time Special Edition, which is a complete single themed, we call them bookazines because they're cardstock covers, 100 pages, all devoted to one single subject. And I've done several over the last couple of years. And this one is devoted entirely to Paul McCartney on the occasion of his 80th birthday, and it runs the gamut from his birth to today. It covers his life and his career in equal measures, and of course, a healthy dose of it is devoted to the Beatles. But also, a significant part of it is also devoted to his solo career and his solo accomplishments, and his impact on pop culture and on society.
Now, you did something similar for John Lennon, a similar project, didn't you?
I
On his
did two,
80th.
yeah, for two years ago. That was actually how I got into this whole business. Really, was I was invited to do one for John Lennon on the occasion of both his what would have been his 80th birthday and the 40th anniversary of his passing. So it kind of suited two purposes, and so this was basically because Paul has lived twice as long as John. There was twice as much material to fit into the same amount of space, so it was a bit of a challenge, but it was a pleasure.
Well, luckily, you had a little longer time to work on the Paul McCartney one as well, didn't
A
you?
little bit, yeah, yeah. I was thinking about, as I was wrapping up the John Lennon one, I was thinking about, well, if they did one for John, chances are they're going to do one for Paul. So I started pitching to my editor, like probably right before I finished the John Lennon book. Um, if you do something like this, please give it to me, basically. And so for the last couple of years, I've been thinking about, well, if I was to do it, what would I put in there? How would I structure it? How would I arrange it? And so I was always going through my head all the things that, the must-have list and the nice-to-have list and the, I can live without list. And just swimming around in my head, and finally, when the green light came, I was able to present my editor with this list that I basically had in my head for about a year and a half, and we ended up using, I would say, about a good 90 to 95% of that list in some way, shape, or form.
Hmm.
We made adjustments, but pretty much everything that I had in mind made it into the book.
Oh, very good. Now, Time Magazine, one of the ultimate periodicals of the 20th century, it's been around for 99 years, only 19 years older than Paul McCartney, which seems strange when you put it in that perspective, just to show you how old these rock stars have become.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, and the fact that so many of them are still at it, still on stage, still doing their thing.
Yeah, for sure. And you really timed this great with McCartney's tours.
I wish I could say we had timed it perfectly. It was really serendipitous in that literally, I think days after I turned in the last chapter of the book, he announced he was going on tour. So I was like, well, this could serve us very well. If it helps sales, great. So it worked out really well.
Well, now you could break McCartney's life up into several sections. Obviously, you mentioned the Beatles. He had his original solo career, and then like a later solo career. Now that he's been, touring like the past 20 years or so, it's been almost a different career for him. What were some of the challenges you faced in writing this long piece?
I mean, I alluded to it before. I think the biggest challenge is, I've only got 100 pages, and
Mhm.
and with the John book, it seems weird to say this, but because John had such a relatively short life, um, it you could pack a lot into those 100 pages. With Paul, there's just so much to cover. There's so many accomplishments, so many achievements, so much work that he's done, so much analysis that you could do, so many events. So it really, one of the biggest challenges was just distilling it all down and not leaving out anything that was really vital, a really vital part of the story. That was probably the most daunting challenge, the thing I was probably the most nervous about, when I went into the project. But also, and I think any Beatles fan who's working on a project like this, um, you really have to check your fandom at the door, and you can't let your love for the band or your love for any particular member of the band get in the way. You really have to stick to the facts. I've been doing this kind of thing for a long time now, and I've written about subjects, people that I admire and like, subjects that I don't admire and don't like. And I think that people who read my stuff wouldn't get a sense of how I feel, personally, one way or the other. And that's the approach that I had to take here. Stick to the facts, and tell the story in a very objective, fact-based way, and not let your fanish tendencies show through.
Okay. Now, there must have been some things that you want to include in this, because obviously the story of McCartney it's been told, I guess, a lot of times, obviously,
Yeah.
and he's been so covered. How did you approach maybe adding new things or taking a different spin on certain parts of his career? Did you have to go through that at all?
Well, yeah, I went in and I talked to my editor, Bob Durr, about this just as this was getting underway, and I was talking about all the stuff that I really wanted to get in there, and also dealing with the reality of how much space we had. But one of the things that I really wanted to do, I personally am just so tired of the focus always being strictly on John and Paul, John and Paul, John and Paul, and
Mhm.
there was going to be plenty of that in here. Obviously, you can't get around it. But one of the things that I always found was underdeveloped, undercovered, so to speak, was the relationship between Paul and George. Paul knew George longer than any of the Beatles. Paul is the one who brought George into the Beatles, and in some ways, the saddest relationship within the
Mhm.
Beatles is the one between Paul and George, because they really had a falling out that I don't think they ever truly recovered from. Um,
Yeah.
their friendship was pretty well damaged by the end of the Beatles, and I don't think it really ever completely healed. So that was one of the things that I really wanted to get into. Unfortunately, and the thing is, I did write a lot of that stuff. A lot of that stuff was written. But as you're putting the book together and you realize how much space you've got, you have to start whittling it down, and you fall into the trap of, this book could easily become the Paul versus George book, and you don't
Mhm.
want that. So my feeling is that the DNA for that is there. There are still traces of that coverage that I wanted to get in there. I just
Mhm.
couldn't get into the depth that I really wanted to get into. But some of the other stuff, like, I would think that a lot of the stuff that I felt was important to get in there, you may not find in a lot of sort of mainstream books of this kind that are trying to appeal to the widest possible audience and not just
Mhm.
the diehards.
Mhm.
So I think that with, for example, one of the things that I felt really needed to be in there was the 1988 induction ceremony of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame,
Oh,
when
yes.
the Beatles were inducted, and Paul was a no-show at the last minute, and it caused a lot of controversy at the time, and he came out of it not looking great, and I felt like, well, this is an important moment that I think a lot of other sort of broad general coverage of Paul and the Beatles, they might just skip it over, not thinking that it's a major pivotal moment. I feel it is, because it just showed, number one, how deep the wounds were from the breakup 18 years earlier. And it also was a moment where I think a lot of people who mistakenly blamed Paul for the breakup of the Beatles and had a lot of resentment towards Paul during that time, and felt that he was the problem, and that he was the one who caused the problems and broke up the band. I think it reaffirmed their beliefs, but all of that turned out to be a myth, as we know today. He didn't break up the Beatles. He was the last one to accept that the Beatles were falling apart. He wanted to
Mhm.
keep the band together. And I think the mythology, and that was perpetuated by John Lennon in his 1970 interview with Rolling Stone. It was certainly perpetuated by Rolling Stone,
Mhm.
and the treatment that Rolling Stone gave Paul in the early days of his solo career. And that was one of the things that I wanted to do was just dispel a lot of the myths.
Those are all good points, particularly the George versus Paul issue, which is an issue. I mean, the history of the band still, the axis of power of McCartney and Lennon, that really shifted once John died. And it doesn't get talked about at all. And a lot of the strife within the Beatles camp has to do with the two guys not getting along that well all the time. That's George and Paul. And you mentioned the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and there was some acrimony over some business dealings. And that carried forward into the anthology project. And it wasn't really, I think, until Linda McCartney passed away that everything kind of said, okay, wait a minute here. We're getting older here. Life is too short. Let's try to let bygones be bygones.
Yeah.
And that seems to be how it went to a point. But like you said, I don't believe George and Paul ever got past some issues, which is a shame because, I mean, Lennon didn't carry a grudge quite like Harrison did. I mean, the Beatles were excellent grudge carriers and some of the best out there. But Harrison has to be the leader. He's the all-star grudge carrier of that band.
There's a quote. Yeah. Well, there's a quote from him where he said, I think it was around the time of the anthology, where he said that with John gone, he felt the need to really call BS wherever he saw it, within the context of the Beatles. And there was no mistaking he was referring to Paul, really. So
is it who's going to call BS on Harrison? Because he was dishing out a lot of bullshit during that time, and it really unnecessarily so.
Yeah.
I mean, things that did not need to be said publicly that tarnished the Beatles' image. I mean, whatever it is between those two guys, that can remain between them. But see, Harrison is a guy that's completely, I think, so out of touch with his fans. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he wanted anything to do with fans, really. A private guy and that. And I think that not understanding of how fans react to that, and unnecessarily, that didn't have to be said, many of those things. And what I'm referring to is, he would continue to take pot shots at McCartney, little digs here and there that were, I mean, most people could see through it, and it just made him look petty.
Yeah.
And so that's a story that's really not been told a lot, because I think there's some clarity that fans could use there. I mean, fans mostly aren't focused on that anyway, but still, it would be nice if some of those things would be cleared up. And a publication like what you started on might have been the place to do that, but it sounds like you might have needed a little more space to do that.
I would have needed at least another 50 pages or so. And it was painful. It's painful. It's like that famous writer's saying is, sometimes you have to kill your darlings. And I did all the research and you should have seen my raw draft. Mm-hmm. But the reality sets in, and that's not really what the project was about. And mm-hmm. and that's one of the things where your objectivity really has to come in, and you have to take a step back and you say, what is this book about? It is about it's a celebration in certain ways. You don't want it to turn into a love fest, because that's not journalistic. But you also don't want to get too bogged down in kind of gossipy and bitchy and that kind of stuff, for mm-hmm. the same reason why, the whole marriage to Heather Mills, I basically deal with in 2 sentences, mm-hmm. because that's not what this is supposed to be about.
That's probably all it's worth too. I mean, there's not much to be said about that, I guess,
Exactly.
I guess you could take more pot shots at McCartney for that decision. People did, and whatever, we all made mistakes like that before.
Yeah. So you have to be really sort of careful. And like I said, I mean, I think my outline was really solid, and the changes and suggestions that my editor made in terms of shaping the structure all made sense. And it's like, well, this is what we have to work with. And I would say, for people who are new to the Beatles story, they will get a complete story.
Mm-hmm.
they will get everything they need to know in a very general sense. If they want more, go out and buy their entire books written about each topic, more or less. And for people who have gone away from the Beatles, or they haven't thought about the Beatles in a while, they want to revisit the story, this is great for them as well. And I try to include, like I said, some deep dives for the hardcore, so that there's something in there for them too. I tried to be as up to date as possible and work in the stuff that I learned from the Get Back documentary, and stuff that I learned from watching your podcast.
Oh, thank you.
So,
yeah, I spent a lot of time on a lot of YouTube videos doing and breaking down all the audio from the Get Back stuff. And that really gave me a lot more clarity as to what went on. My intention was to maybe do 1 or 2 videos, and it ended up being like maybe a dozen, because I got sucked into how interesting the information they were giving me was. And it was really telling a different story, or a more complete and more full story, that we then got to see even more fully done with Jackson's Get Back.
Right.
And so that was really a lot of fun to do. And once I can see, like, if you're working on a subject within this project, you can get excited about putting it together. And I've been there, and it feels great to be able to feel like you're bringing something new to the table.
Yeah, it's something new and something more accurate. Certainly telling a clearer picture. I mean, one of the myths that I really wanted to just dispel was, getting back to the whole Paul and George thing, is, the reason why George walked out on the Beatles. It's not fair to blame an argument. It wasn't even an argument that happened 3 or 4 days earlier, just because of the way a 52-year-old movie was cut, where you think that that was the cause. I mean, even the Beatles don't remember the reason anymore why George left, but we know it wasn't the exchange between George and Paul that led to, well, I'll play whatever you want, and if you don't want me to play, I won't play. That wasn't why George quit.
Well, yeah, one of the things that I dealt with, I mean, the many narratives that are a part of the Beatles history, the end of the Beatles, the basic narrative was that, they did Let It Be, and they weren't getting along, and they showed this quasi argument or disagreement between Paul and George, and that's why George walked out, and that they weren't getting along. It was like a meme for the entire breakup of the band, and that stood for 52 years.
Right.
And that when I started delving into the audio recordings, I'm like, well, that's not how it was. That was 4 days earlier. So people were, and it's not really the fault of the fans. It's the fault of the journalists, the biographers, and the people who stake a claim in telling the Beatles story. And they told it for shit.
Yeah.
And they did it with bias, and they did it with anger. And it's now taking, as historiography often does, 50 years past the dates of the events to really sort it out more thoroughly. And you can take all the players' words and sift through the bias, because there is bias. And there's people today, I mean, some of the earlier response I got from some of my videos were that basically that these fans will only believe what the principals that were there tell them. Right. So in other words, Lennon remembers the Jan Wenner interview, the 3-hour interview in late 1970. That's like the gold standard. That's absolute 100% truth. That's what these people tell me. Well, they're full of shit, because Lennon admitted that he not only didn't tell it straight, he was whacked out on cocaine and heroin. And I mean, these things do matter. And you can be in a bad mood and say something that you don't quite mean. And he walked back on all that. And but still, now people want, especially the anti-Paul people, they want to just cherry pick the meat that they love to eat. And unfortunately, some biographers and people that write the history on the Beatles have taken that same approach. So that thankfully, there's, with YouTubers and all these hundreds of podcasts and the work you've done and others, now there's more people, more voices to help sift through the bullshit. And it needed some sifting, and people needed to be called out on it, like the Philip Normans and the Jan Wenners and these people who disgraced themselves in print by not being honest.
Well, I mean, I did quote John in some parts in my book, but not to sort of like just kind of leave it there and say, well, this is what, John had to say about it. I put it in there and said, yeah, but here's what Paul had to say about it, or
Mhm.
here are the facts. Here's what John said. Just to make it clear that I don't just take what John said at face value and just leave it. I wanted to give it context. I can't read his mind and say, well, this is why he said it. I said, but this is what he told Jan Wenner, but here's what was really going on.
Right, right. Give it some context. Like
Yeah.
I mentioned the anthology, which is a project that really has not aged very well to this point. But there's a scene in there where they're talking about all you need is love. And they're trying to figure out, well, how did this song originate? And each one of the Beatles told a different story. And then George Martin was kind of like silent. And the way it was cut was very humorously done. But the humor there overshadowed the fact that these guys, though there, could not tell the same story to save their life on that song and where that originated from. Now, why couldn't that be the case for a good part of their history? Well, the fact is that that is the case.
Yeah.
So, and people are they don't want to accept that. I mean, we're not going to ever know the exact truth. Man, you tell me to go back to when I was like 21 on a certain day on my graduation or something. I can't remember barely anything. I can look at a few photos. Oh yeah, this guy was there. I can't remember that. Why would I expect the Beatles to?
Exactly. And you're right. I mean, a lot of it has to do with I was saying before, with personal bias. I mean, I growing up when I was in high school, Rolling Stone to me was the paper of record for rock and roll for my generation and all that kind of stuff. And not that I bought into the overt Leninist. Well, it's hard to say because I loved John Lennon growing up. I mean, I was about 10 or 11 when he was killed. I was just getting into the Beatles at that time. I was a Beatles fan from 1977 on. I was like 8 years old. I got my first Beatles record, which was the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl. And I was waiting for them to get back together again. Of course, they're going to get back together again. And the Beatles, and so John dies. And so all of my focus is on John, and I discover Rolling Stone, and so John was a big deal, and I loved Paul too. I loved Paul's songs, and I thought he was a funny and charming and all that. But I so bought into Rolling Stone that when I read their reviews of McCartney's first couple of solo albums and saw how they eviscerated them, I was like, well, I'm not going to touch these with a 10-foot pole. So I bought Band on the Run, and I bought Tug of War and all the stuff that, of course you got to get, but I avoided those first two albums for years. And then in the mid 90s, I was like, you know what, I'll take a chance. I went to Tower Records in New York City, and I bought McCartney and I bought Ram, and I listened to them all the way through. And I sat there, I was stunned. And I said, why did I let Rolling Stone keep me away from these albums for as long as I did? I love them. I think they're fantastic. I think Ram is, one of Paul's masterpieces. I think it's a great album. And,
go ahead. Sorry, I finish your thought.
And I was going to say, just because Jan Wenner was pissed off that that the Beatles broke up, and he bought into John, he wanted to stay on John's good side. He used his magazine as a weapon. We know that he did now, because as I was wrapping up my book, I found interviews with people who were at Rolling Stone at the time, including Greil Marcus, who came right out and said that Jan Wenner took a positive review of McCartney, the first McCartney solo album, and had it rewritten to make it negative, because he had a personal beef against McCartney because he wanted to stay in John's good graces. I was stunned. That hurt a lot. That's like finding out there's no Santa Claus.
Yeah, that was a real eye opener to me, because I didn't think that Wenner went that far, but indeed he did. And it's really, I mean, and this came out later, and so people at the time had no idea.
Right.
And the albums that were vilified, like Ram, for instance, was horribly reviewed. And what's interesting is how history tries to correct some of the wrongs of the past. Now we find Ram is almost, in my view, an over-adulation for Ram. But I can see why that is. And people want to look at something that was vilified,
Mhm.
which it was unfairly,
Yeah.
and it's grown from an underdog perspective years later. So it's funny how these things, how like records come in and out of vogue. I mean, this, you can say the same with Sergeant Pepper, which is now going through a bit of the last 12 years or so. It's not revered as it once was.
Right.
There's a hangover from the adulation. And it's funny how these things just kind of, the life, you never quite know where it's going to go.
That's a very good point. Um, yeah, I mean, I can only come at it from my own personal perspective in that, and maybe it was because I was expecting a stink bomb and I was so impressed that it wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
that maybe I overcompensated. I don't know. All I know is I can sit down and listen to Ram and just be transported, and
Mm-hmm.
I just in my opinion, there's not a bad song on that album, and I can't say that about every McCartney album. I can't say it about most albums actually,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but that's one of the ones where I just find it to be such a smooth and easy listen, and a consummate craftsmanship all the way through. And again, I just regret that I think of all the years that I missed out that I could have been listening to it,
Mm-hmm.
because I bought into the credibility and the reputation of Rolling Stone, and I didn't know any better.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that McCartney is turning 80 and he's still touring, and we have a handful of other rock stars. I say the big three are McCartney, Dylan, and Jagger. And
Okay.
there's others. Brian Wilson's turning 80 soon, and you've got a couple handfuls of others as well that are
The
getting up
Who.
there. Yes, so we're going to start losing these guys rather quickly. And in the case of McCartney, it's interesting how people still want to go see him. I mean,
Yeah.
he's still a Beatle, and even though obviously his voice is not even what it was even 10 years ago, and they just want to be in the presence. And it gets a little worshipful for my taste. I saw McCartney last in, I think, 2012, so it's 10 years ago. And no, I saw him in, I think, 2014.
Okay.
And the last two times I saw him, I kind of regretted going. It wasn't. I saw a great show that he did in 2002, and he just couldn't top that for me.
Right.
So I didn't need to be in his presence, and I kind of regretted going to some of those. And so for me, the line in the sand I drew some time ago,
Yeah.
and in those years back, I didn't think his voice was suited for some of the songs he was singing. Others was pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So he keeps aging, and I think he said that he was just going to keep doing it until people stop coming. Was that what he said? Something to that effect?
Something to that effect. Yeah. Yeah. I get into this a little bit in the book. Why does he keep doing it? He's got absolutely. I make the argument that as of pretty much 1979, Paul no longer had anything to prove. I mean, that was the year that he was inducted into the Guinness Book of World Records as the most successful composer of all time. He has nothing more to prove. He stopped having anything to prove a long time ago. Um, you know, I use a quote from Ringo in the book where Ringo just plainly states Paul's a workaholic. He just has to keep working. And Paul has pretty much said the same thing. He said, yeah, I could retire, but and do what? Sit around the house and watch TV all day? It's like, that's no kind of life for me. He loves what he does. And as long as he's physically capable of getting up on stage and doing it, why should he stop? Also, there's the legacy aspect. I think at this point, Paul, more than anybody else, more than Dylan, more than Jagger and Richards, he really is the living embodiment of the 60s, of the rock generation, the classic rock generation. And the Beatles. I mean, Ringo was still out there, and Ringo does the All-Star Band and all that, and he's great and funny, and peace and love and all that. But he's not Paul McCartney.
Right.
I love Ringo, but he's not Paul. And so I think Paul relishes that. I think he relishes being more or less the last word on the Beatles. And he wants to keep putting it out there as long as he possibly can. And I think some of it might be as a way to address the years where he was diminished. I mean, he was put down, especially in the years after John died, where
Yes.
John was elevated almost to sainthood. He was
Yeah.
certainly a martyr. And people were taking pot. I mean, the stuff that Philip Norman said about McCartney was just, I was 12 years old when I read Shout. And I didn't know nearly as much about the Beatles as I would in my later teen years. And I would be reading Shout and saying, this doesn't seem right to me. This seems like a lot of bullshit,
Yeah.
that John was 3/4 of the Beatles, and Paul, he was just basically riding his coattails, and that all Paul wanted to do from 1965 on was, I think the way Norman described it was, when Paul did Eleanor Rigby, which was the first basically solo Beatles song, because it was only Paul, that with Eleanor Rigby, McCartney did what he wanted to do for the long time, which is basically step out on his own without the other guys. And I remember being 12 years old and thinking, yeah, but Paul is the one who put together Let It Be, and Paul is the one who was trying to keep them going. And it's just, and this was the stuff that he had to fight. So I think that this is really important to him, to show that, yeah, he wasn't riding John's coattails, that he had a lot to do with it also. Look at me, look at what I've done.
Yeah, I wonder in his later years, like the past 20 years, if he's still overcompensating for that, being treated that way in the 70s. So in the 70s, in the prime of his solo career, which was his prime, he took a lot of heat from the rock press.
Oh yeah.
He wasn't considered. Well, the thing about rock music at that time, coming out of the late 60s, was that it got very elitist, thanks to publications like the Rolling Stone, who aligned themselves with, radical left-wing politics, of which Lennon was used to launch that magazine. So Wenner knew exactly what Lennon was bringing, and he used that to the maximum. And McCartney, for all the great music he did in the 70s, it was more AM radio friendly. It was more top 40, but I don't see why that should be held against him. And he did stuff on those albums that was FM radio worthy, but he had an image, and it was basically who he was.
Right.
And I think there was just the way that the rock press decided to tell it, that's the part that wasn't fair. And like you said earlier, some of these albums got completely just trashed, based not on the quality of the music, but based on a perceived perception of Paul McCartney. And I think that from like the 90s forward, from the Anthology project forward, he's been still maybe trying to show his stuff. And like, for example, the lyric book that he came out, I think that was that fancy thing he came out with last year. It came out. I thought that was an indication, along with all these box sets that are coming out of his albums. And I would say that some of these albums of his do not justify that lavish of a treatment.
Right.
Because I really believe that kind of treatment should be held for really special works, of which, some of his works are. And the fans still eat it up. So there is the fan part of it that, makes this work on some level. But the lyric books, the lyrics are arguably the weakest part of McCartney's game. Nobody can touch him with melody. He's a great musician, but lyrics has always been one of those things where he, justifiably you can say, well, that's a weak point of his game. And yet he comes out with this lavish thing that is emphasizing his lyrics. That's a little bit, I think, going too far, perhaps. And again, I think it may be a reaction to the way he was treated all those years after the Beatles broke up. So I'm willing to give him a pass for that. But I think had he been treated like John was treated, I don't think we'd be seeing him propping up some of his old stuff as nearly as much.
Well, it's funny because when they first announced the lyrics book, I wasn't interested because he had put out a book years and years ago. I think it was called Blackbird Singing,
Mm.
which was his poetry and his, the poetry and the songs, which it was a mix of both. And I was like, I didn't buy that book. It's like if I'm interested in the lyrics, I'll put the record on. And so when I heard about this, I was kind of ready to skip it. And then I found out that it's not just the lyrics, it's the stories behind the songs. And so that I was interested in because that makes it much more substantial.
Mhm.
And he goes into some, it's some of it's the same old stories that you've heard over and over again,
Mhm.
but there's some good biographical stuff in there.
Mhm.
And so for me, that it was worth it. Also, it's not just the lyrics typeset, it's the actual handwritten lyrics in many cases. And it's just interesting to see these artifacts. They're beautifully scanned. I don't want to sound like I'm plugging the book,
Mhm.
but for me, it was worth it, just because it's not just the lyrics, it's the stories behind the songs.
Okay.
um, Certainly, as well as Paul can tell it, you have to take some of it with a grain of salt, because he is known to either forget the details or uh, just get them wrong, that kind of thing. But from the specific pieces that I read, and I did use that book as a resource while I was researching, I was like, man, this sounds pretty straight to me. This jives with
Mhm.
what I know. So okay, and I think I included some quotes from the book. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I certainly did use it as a reference when I was writing my book.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would have liked to see McCartney do, and I would have had even more respect for him, is if about 15 years ago, when he was still, could really do a great job live,
Mhm.
is to focus on a series of shows that are just his solo works in smaller venues. Because
Yeah.
one thing I've learned about Paul McCartney fans, he's got a very, very strong set of fans that would love that.
Mhm.
In other words, I thought he should have given something special to the fans live like that. He seems to use the live stage to appeal to everybody,
Right.
which is like, that's why we get all the Beatles songs and stuff. He's not, he does the same songs over and over. We
Mhm.
got Here Today is his tribute to John. He got Something as a tribute to George. And you hear the same stories he tells in between songs. I think he could have really given his fans something special by doing smaller shows and focusing on some of his more obscure solo stuff. And in turn, what he's done is he's relied to do special stuff for the fans. He's essentially, um, it's almost like eulogizing himself by doing these special box sets of of albums that don't really deserve it.
Mhm.
I think that, and that again is a slight, I think it's a slight disconnect from the fans.
Mhm.
I don't know. I mean, it just seems silly to have, was it Press to Play, to have some fancy box set where there's other albums out there that are certainly worthy of it.
Yeah.
And I don't blame the fans for buying it because it's there for them. And not all the fans buy it, but many do. I just find it peculiar. I just think he's trying to, he gets accused of revisionism, sometimes unfairly,
Mhm.
but this is something that it's almost like a legacy. He's trying to prop up his own work. And that's not something the artist should do. That's something we should do.
Mhm.
And I think it's, just because someone can afford it doesn't means it's worthy of praise.
First of all, has he done a box set of Press to Play?
I can't keep track of all of them.
Okay.
He's done at least a dozen. I mean, they're all
Yeah.
over the map. I don't have any of them. I'm not really interested in that.
Mhm.
The Beatles stuff I am interested in, but
Yeah.
are we going to get a Revolver box set? Are we going to get Please Please Me? I don't know. I
Right.
don't know that it needs to be done. The Beatles certainly are worthy of it.
Right.
Is Back to the Egg worthy of it? That's what the fans are clamoring for. I don't know. I don't think so.
Mhm.
I mean, I think a lot of his work is average work.
Hmm.
It's got some gems among all that, but I find a lot of it average, and some albums stand out more than others. And what I find with McCartney in particular is that some fans, certain albums really have deep meaning for them. And it's clear to me that McCartney is best listened to retrospectively,
Hmm.
because it's really, he's got quite a body of work that's rather consistent, and consistent even in the mediocrity as well. Because some of it is you've got some songs that, as great as a song like Silly Love Songs is, next to another song on that album that is just like, whoa, this is terrible to me anyway. So I mean, his work is uneven,
Hmm.
but I mean, it's still a brilliant body of work. And most McCartney fans differ from me on that. I mean, I'm very hard on the Beatles' solo careers, not just McCartney, but all of
Sure.
them.
Sure.
And because quite frankly, they have to be held up to the standard of the Beatles, which
That's
is
right.
completely natural.
Right.
And some people don't like to hear that.
Well, in terms of his live stuff, I agree with you. I think that he has neglected a sizable chunk of his solo career. I mean, I've seen him about 5 or 7 times over the from 1999, 1989 to today.
Mm-hmm.
And I would always leave kind of disappointed about all the great stuff from Wings and from his solo years that he didn't do. To this day, I've never seen him do Junior's Farm live.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Or Uncle Albert.
or Uncle Albert, I mean, I would have loved to have seen him do Come and Get It, even though that's technically
Mm-hmm.
not,
Sure.
but it's one of his. And in 2002, which was probably the best time that certainly the most meaningful time I ever saw him.
Mm-hmm.
I saw him here in New York, out on Long Island, and it was an indoor stadium, and he did Mother Nature's Son, and I started crying. And my wife turned to me and she said, what's going on? Why are you crying? And I said, I never thought I'd ever see him play this live. This is a song that always had meaning for me. And it's kind of a deep cut when you think about it,
Oh, definitely.
Now, of course, that's a Beatles song, but I'm saying if he could have given that same kind of attention to some of his solo stuff, I would have loved to have seen him do more like what he did when he did that MTV Unplugged TV show, something more intimate, something acoustic, where he could pull stuff out and do stuff like Every Night. Just a quick anecdote: the 1991 Unplugged TV special was the first time I ever heard Every Night. What was it? Was it the first? Well, certainly the first time I ever saw him do it live.
Mm-hmm.
I was already familiar with the song. You know what? It was the first time I ever heard him play Junk.
Okay.
And that might have been the first time I ever heard Junk, and because I didn't have the McCartney album yet. So stuff like that. I mean, it was great exposure, and to pull that stuff out of the attic and introduce it and play it for people in that a more intimate setting so that it's not so overblown. And you're right, he is trying to appeal to the widest possible audience. He's a people pleaser. I mean, that's what he feels like he has to entertain the widest possible audience, which is why I think when you see him in interviews and the interviewer is specifically talking about anything but the Beatles, talking about his solo careers, his solo projects, whatever he's doing now, he always manages to take the conversation back to the Beatles. Even the interviewer doesn't bring it up. He does, because he knows, I think on some subconscious level, that's what people really want to hear about. That's what he thinks people really want to hear about,
Yeah, agreed. I saw that 2002 show as well, and that was an indoor arena, and I always felt that, because I've seen him outdoors 3 other times, the indoor show was far better, and he just seemed to be able to communicate with the audience better indoors.
Yeah.
And that was just a great show. So he would have been 60 then, roughly, and he's 80 and 20 years ago. So he was really, I thought, at a high point. It's funny to say somebody is 60 years old and in their prime live, but he was really, really excellent show. And the whole presentation was good. Just even the stuff off stage that was part of the show that he wasn't a part of was excellent. And so the shows I saw, the two shows I saw after that, just didn't really live up to that in any way at all. So that I was left with a little bit of a bad taste because of that. But hey, that's how it is. Not every show can be great.
Right.
And I've seen other bad shows and other great shows, and that's just part of the live concert going experience.
Yeah. I mean, I don't cover. I mean, I cover the tours in my book. Like I said, I didn't know about this tour when I was wrapping it up, and I think I literally think it was either the just a few days after I sent the last chapter, or it might have been when I was looking at the proofs, the final proofs of the book, was when he announced this Got Back tour that he's doing, and I was like, oh, well, I mean, I would have liked to have added a line about it, somewhere in the book, and it would be nice, but yeah, we get into it, and I get into the 1976 tour, and how that was really what he wanted to be doing in the final days of the Beatles, and that's one of the reasons why they broke up.
Yeah, one of the great things McCartney did in the 70s, and perhaps the best move he made, was he toured around Europe a little bit, off and on, touring and getting the band in shape and getting used to the live thing again. So when he hit America in 76,
he was ready.
He was ready, and and that was a time also, there was tons of double and triple live albums coming out at this time. Double live albums in particular. You had, Kiss, and you had Frampton, and you had the Allman Brothers, and you had, so he fit in really well with all that. He could stand up to anybody. And so that was a great move. And so he clearly likes touring, and he likes the adulation, clearly. So why he's loath to give it up.
Well, it was also the connection with the audience was always important to him, and that was the argument that he made to the other Beatles about that they were getting stale because they had lost that direct connection to the audience. He loved. I'm sure the adulation doesn't hurt, but at that 2002 concert, that tour that both of us saw him at, he was funny when he would do his in between songs, the patter. If he was repeating the same thing night after night, he at least made it sound new and natural. He was funny. It was really great. And I think that he really was meant for that kind of thing. And I think he knows it. So yeah, I think that a lot of it is he's just doing what he wants to be doing for as long as he can physically do it. The voice isn't quite there anymore. I don't think it's a slam to say that. I think it's an objective thing to say. But he gets the affirmation when he's selling out and people are going to see him. They just keep coming back.
I had the opportunity to see Brian Wilson, and I think it was 2019, and that was a rough show. The one I saw, he had no business being on stage.
Right.
I mean, they opened up the curtain. He was behind his piano, so you don't even know if he walked out there or not. Or I don't know if he was playing, but he was coughing in the middle of the song while he was singing, and I was like holding on for dear life. I hope he gets through this song. And the reviewers for that tour were very kind. They didn't bring up too much of what I just said. Some people, you read some comments, but there wasn't much video out there either to watch. But I would hate to see McCartney do that, and he's not there yet. So I can't imagine him going out like that. But it's getting to the point where this is where we are with these people, and so you see them at your own risk.
Exactly. I mean, there was a definite cutoff point for me with Brian Wilson. I was lucky to see him at, arguably his best, which was the Pet Sounds tour of 2006, maybe.
Yeah.
And he was phenomenal. I
mean,
he was
2002, maybe 2001, 2002.
No, well, this was for the 40th anniversary.
Oh, okay.
He toured Pet Sounds again. This was not the first Pet Sounds tour. This was like the second or third. But I saw him in New York, and with Brian Wilson, you're never sure which one you're going to get. I mean, from show to show, you might get a different Brian Wilson. And I was lucky enough to see him on a night where he was just nailed it. I mean, his voice sounded great, and he was like really in tune with the audience, and it was great. That probably should have been the last time that I saw him. And
Yeah,
yeah.
It's hard to know when to go out. I mean, we've seen this with athletes and
Yeah.
stick around too long, and it's hard, and it's not. I'm not saying it's easy, but yeah, it's getting to be that time. I mean, the Stones they're still going to be out touring, and it's people want to say, and it's kind of like, well, I'm going to see them for the last time. I got one more chance to see them, so they go out and see the Stones. But it's getting kind of a feat of like an athletic feat for Jagger to be able to still dance around out there like that. It's really quite amazing.
Well, I mean, 50 years from now, I mean, we probably won't be here, but when Keith Richards is touring with a completely new lineup of the Rolling Stones, it's
he'll still be with us. Yeah.
People are still going to see it.
Yeah. These guys, I'm telling you, I thought back in the 80s and 90s when there was kind of a resurgence of 60s music in particular.
Right, I remember.
So when these guys would come back and tour, I said, "Oh, I got to see these guys because who knows how long they're going to keep touring." And that was like in the late 80s and 90s, and McCartney's 80, and he can probably if I was on stage, he probably has more stamina than I do on stage, But
well, it's funny because the book that in my time book, I think the only piece that I didn't write, it was we pulled something from the Time archives, and it was an interview with McCartney on the occasion of him turning 50, and that was a big deal. And when you think about, my God, that was 30 years ago. And think about how much of his life has changed even since then. Linda was a big part of the article at that time, and his kids were still kids. Stella I think was studying fashion at the time. His son James I think was maybe a late teenager, just getting out of his teens. It just was such his whole life was so different back then, and you just get no sense. You're reading this and knowing that he has no idea of what lies ahead, the good and the bad. And I think it was great to include that because it really gives a nice contrast with all the present day stuff that I included, the triumphs and the tragedies, and I devote quite a bit of space to Linda, because how could you not? And the impact that she had on him, and the influence and the help that she gave him every step of the way.
It was such a loss when she died young that in these last 20 years, the information she could give, I mean, she would have been a very valuable source of information because she was there and just a different perspective. And the thing I appreciated about her, she always pretty much told it straight. McCartney, you might not get it straight from him. Yeah. He would give,
he equivocates
evasive, be a little evasive, but Linda would give it to you straight. So that's a big loss. So the history telling that we don't get from her it's really a shame that we don't have that.
Yeah, one of the most insightful pieces that I used as my reference was the 1984 Playboy interview that Paul and Linda did. This was to promote "Give My Regards to Broad Street," which I also mentioned in the book as not one of the triumphs, but she was pretty forthcoming, and she couldn't get into details for obvious reasons, but she just came right out and said, well, I think the question was, what's your relationship like with Yoko these days? This was only 4 years after John had died. And Linda just made no bones about it. It's really tough being her business partner. She didn't go into details, but it kind of lifted the veil a little bit on this facade that, oh yeah, everything's hunky-dory and they're all getting along, and it's one big happy family, and I appreciated that.
Yeah, no, it's no secret that Yoko can be difficult, and she's never been very complimentary to Paul in particular, who's in some ways bent over backwards for her in several occasions. And the thing I think that happened after Linda died, it seems that maybe they did kind of patch up some differences and say, well, hey, we're just going to keep all the dirty laundry between us, and publicly we're not going to air that anymore. It's too bad it took them 25 years to figure that out, because we had to, the fans had to put up with their dirty laundry, and as they squabbled in the press and said snarky things, but that kind of went away eventually, which was, I think, the professional way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, and there's some stuff that it's like you wish you could be a fly on the wall to get the real story. I mean, when you know that Paul actually did make the effort, and Yoko actually acknowledged this finally publicly around 2000, is the role that Paul played in helping John and Yoko get back together. There was nothing in it for Paul other than to help his friend.
Yeah.
You would think that after that kind of gesture, there wouldn't be this kind of petty bitchiness between them, and it just continued, and I would just love to understand it. Is it just a matter of just two people, the chemistry, just two people who cannot get together? It could be, but I would think that, what, if this guy who I didn't have a great relationship with, he's willing to do this for me, maybe I should look at him in a different light and not be so hard on him. Comparing him to Salieri, and and your husband to Amadeus Mozart, and you're making Paul out to be Salieri. That was a really low blow.
And he got it also from Harrison. Harrison also would give his digs here and there.
Yeah.
And that did also stop, I think, once Linda passed away. But
But you know what? It's George. It's like, it's almost kind of like, well, you know what, George, I'll take it from. He's my brother.
Yeah.
You're an outsider kind of thing. You're not a blood relative kind of thing.
And I always got the feeling that when they got together, that, Harrison and McCartney could be cool with one another.
Yeah.
And the jibes and some of the, sending each other up publicly was kind of, maybe it was just something understood between them, but deep down they really knew how it was between them. And there's underneath it all, there was something that was okay with them. And I mean, I don't know, I'm guessing, but
they did socialize. They socialized.
They did socialize. Yeah, they did. And they were able to put differences aside.
Sure.
And sometimes when George got to talking about the Beatles, it just still irritated him. So, but like I said, they were able to kind of put all those things past him. And when, Harrison was dying, I mean, McCartney went to see him and held his hand. I mean, you get to the point in life where a lot of that shit just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And it takes some big events for that to come to pass.
Well, that's one of the things in the anthology, in my book, I do talk about the anthology, and that it is clear in some of the contemporary clips where it's the three of them together, sometimes with George Martin, sometimes not. You can pick up just how uncomfortable George is in Paul's presence, and I acknowledge that, which I think that, again, a lot of publications like the one that I did, they won't mention that. They'll just say, oh, and they got back together for the anthology. And then but I talk about the fact that you could see that, there was still friction between them. And some of the behind the scenes stuff that's on YouTube, you can see there's moments where, Paul is trying to kid around with George, and George glares at the camera. And it's like, whoa. I mean, you can't interpret it any other way, that George does not want to be trifled with. You don't, he'll take it from Ringo. He won't take it from Paul. And so I do delve into that a little bit. And my understanding is shortly after the anthology, Paul tried to reach out to George numerous times, and he was just getting stonewalled. And he didn't understand why. And there's a comedian TV host named John Fugelsang, who had done he actually did George's last television interview, and he also did a town hall TV special with McCartney a short time later. and he happened to be talking to McCartney's manager at the time. And he said, yeah, I was just talking to George the other day. And Paul's manager said, oh, he'll talk to you, but he won't return Paul's calls. And
Mhm.
Fugelsang was like, whoa, I didn't mean
Yeah.
to strike a nerve, but that was
Yeah.
what was going on. I'd say around 97, 98. And of course, then, George was diagnosed with cancer, and I think things changed after that.
Yeah. I don't
Uh,
know what Harrison, what his deal was, because
yeah.
if you remember now at the end of, after the anthology stuff, because that third new song never came out.
Mhm.
It probably wasn't, Harrison was not up for it. He said, hey, this
Right.
song sucks. I
Right.
don't want to do it. And so there was problems in putting those 3 CD packages together.
Mhm.
And some songs were removed that fans would have liked to have seen again. George Harrison not being really understanding what the fans want or need. And Harrison, after all that anthology business was over and the DVDs came out or whatever, he released a statement that basically said there will be no more Beatles stuff coming out. There was no need for it to even be said.
Right. It was odd.
And it was very strange. And, somebody should have reminded him, say, hey, look, buddy, the whole reason the anthology even happened because you were out of money and the other guys agreed to do this.
Yeah.
I just thought that was the shittiest thing. And I'm like, what in the hell is with this guy?
Yeah.
So, and it took his, I suppose his cancer and some things to really alter the trajectory of where those relationships were going, which seemed to be the cemetery anyway.
Mhm.
And there was something salvaged, but it's really sad. But I mean, this is what happens on the really big money levels, and I mean, we'll never understand
Right.
the level of stress and all that. And Harrison was taken by a manager prior to that. I mean, there
Yeah.
was a lot going on, and
Mhm.
so he seemed to take it out maybe from my perspective on the wrong people, but it's just a shame that the fans have to bear some of the brunt of that.
Yeah, I mean, we do. I mean, a lot of that stuff has leaked out, just not through official channels.
Mhm.
Um, you know, uh, like I know for some bizarre reason, you can get the Beatles rehearsal versions of All Things Must Pass from the Let It Be sessions everywhere but the Let It Be box set, which has like entire discs devoted to the rehearsals and the stuff that, was lying in the vaults. And so when I first heard that they were doing this box set, I thought it was a no-brainer. All Things Must Pass has got to be in there. And yeah, there's a snippet from a version that I never heard before, but there's a lot of good versions out
You
there that are
know,
much better.
yeah, you're scratching me right where I itch. And that song, I thought, well, what is the reason for not putting it, on the box set? Now, the Peter Jackson film, Get Back, had maybe about 20 seconds of them playing it,
Yeah.
very little.
Yeah.
And I did a whole 2-part video on this where they did it like 70 some times. And
Yes.
I mean, with the software available today, that some of which was demonstrated in the Get Back, in the whole production process, the audio software is even getting better. There's probably a time now, and I may even be attempting this. I have this Get Back hangover. I'm just kind of waiting to get back into it. But creating a proper version, a higher quality version of All Things Must Pass, as done by the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why wouldn't there be anything better that was given to us in either the film or on the box set? And the only thing I can think of is that, well, maybe the Harrison estate wants to keep that song more aligned with George Harrison's solo career. I mean, I can understand that. But to me, the Beatles come first.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in some entities are just bigger than individuals. And the Beatles is one of those things. And that's one of the things I'll be talking about in upcoming videos about how the Beatles lost sight of that. And I can understand why. But here's an example of even that All Things Must Pass box set, which seemed to be a little bit probably the most far removed from what fans really wanted or could afford, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in other words, the Harrison estate still seems to be the farthest away from the fans. They seem to not have a good connection with them at all and understanding their fans.
Mm-hmm.
And charging $1,000 for a box. Well, some people bought it, but a lot of people can't, and they have to buy the smaller version on 2 CDs or whatever it is.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, you still get that, and the curating of their catalogs still seems to be maybe some acrimony or some bitchiness or some territorialism going on there. I mean, I don't know, but I guess we've been given so much, and we always want more. And that's kind of a problem the fans have to deal with.
Sure.
And the Beatles know that. So, and, they can only do what they can do, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, it's this, the stuff that's out there. Again, I was like, I've had for the last 25 years, a bootleg of the Glenn Johns version of Get Back, the Get Back album. And so now we have an officially released, professionally mastered version. But it was already out there. So it's like, you can't really complain, because especially now, because I bought it well before YouTube. I'm sure you can get the whole version that I've had for all these years. You can get it for free on YouTube. You just want a better version. You want the best possible version, but you can't be too much of a not a miser, the opposite of a miser. You can't be too much of a hoarder or a glutton.
Yeah.
Be happy with what you've got, and be grateful that the technology is out there, that you can pretty much just type in the name of a Beatles track, an obscure Beatles track that was never supposed to be released, and chances are you can get it. It would be great to get it with the noise and the clicks and the hiss removed, but you could still get to hear it. And so I mean, it's me being a little too fanish and saying, I want those versions of All Things Must Pass that I already have. You know what I mean?
Right.
I just want it better. I want it to sound better.
Yes, I do too.
So that's, but
What I always say is that as Beatle fans, what is it we want? We want more. Will we ever get enough? I don't think so. So, I mean, that's just part of being a fan. And, I mean, some of the Beatles have to deal with us too. I mean, we're not the easiest to deal with either. So, it goes both ways.
But we want more, which is why, like for example, you did a podcast, and I wrote my blog about, the Beatles albums that they could have made after Abbey Road, where we put together entire albums, using what we know about what was in the mix back then. And so, it's because in our minds, we can't help but think, what if they gave us just 3 more years,
Well, that's how special they were. And it's probably hard for them to understand that. Yeah. And, they've had to live with it, unfortunately. There are worse things to live with, though.
Exactly.
So, all right, Glenn. Well, I think this was a great conversation. I'm glad you were able to join me here. Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Greenberg, his Paul McCartney at 80 Time Magazine edition will be out by the time this video airs. Glenn, where can people get it?
You can get it right now. The probably the easiest way to get it is through Amazon. You just type in Time Special Edition McCartney, and it's probably going to be the first thing that pops up. I suspect that in the next few days and weeks, you'll be able to find them at Barnes and Nobles, Whole Foods, various drugstores, pharmacies, supermarkets, Stop and Shop, Dwayne Reed, CVS, Walgreens. You never know where they'll pop up. They could pop up at all of them, but I would say right now, probably the best place to go is through Amazon.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And Glenn, we'll have to do this again sometime.
I would love
There's all kinds of topics we can talk about. Do you ever get talking about the Beatles?
Never.
Yeah, same here. All right, well, we'll do it again. And thank you for joining us. And people, you will see us again sometime here on Pop Goes the 60s.